Most people assume Norway and the US are allies in polar opposite ways: peace, oil, fjords, and friendship. But guess what? As of August 7, 2025, the US slapped a 15% tariff on Norwegian goods, everything from salmon to sofas, overnight. Why? Is this even strategic or just chaos by executive fiat? What does it mean for your wallet, Norway's economy, and the fragile balance in global trade? Stay tuned, because today we are unwrapping the hidden collision between Norway's flagship exports and Trump's sweeping new tariff regime. Kindly hit the subscribe button. I upload every 72 hours. Imagine Norway, a picture of stability, renowned for salmon, sleek furniture, and one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. Most Norwegians feel insulated from global trade conflicts, confident their economy is anchored by the EU's single market and robust natural resources. Yet, in 2025, that confidence hit a rare tremor. It all began on April 2, when the US, under Trump, dropped a trade bombshell, sweeping reciprocal tariffs on nearly all imports. The US slapped a 10% blanket tariff, with even higher rates up to 25% targeted at specific countries and goods. The fallout was immediate. Wall Street wobbled, consumer prices began to climb, and global alliances braced for impact. A few months later, on July 31st, a new executive order sealed the deal. Beginning on August 7, the US imposed an extra 15% tariff on Norwegian imports, affecting everything from salmon fillets to acorns furniture, but exempting energy exports. This came at a sensitive moment. In 2024, Norwegian exports to the US totaled 62 billion Norwegian crowns, with salmon alone accounting for over 1/5, and US demand for Norwegian salmon had doubled since 2019. Now, an entire industry teetered under the weight of new costs. Economists warn tariffs behavior can slow growth and raise prices. One analysis suggests that 2025's US tariffs could reduce US real GDP growth by up to 0.9 percentage points, increasing consumer prices by 2.3%, equating to around $3,800 lost in household purchasing power. Meanwhile, Norwegian businesses scrambled. Furniture makers like Acorns signaled price hikes. Seafood exporters eyed alternative markets, and the sovereign wealth fund felt pressure from asset volatility. On the diplomatic front, EU leaders pledged to shield Norway from being caught in a broader US-EU skirmish, stressing that 2/3 of Norwegian exports still flow to the EU. Now, why it matters? Economically, this isn't just about tariffs. It's about global supply chains rewiring, consumer costs rising, and trade-dependent industries scrambling. Geopolitically, a traditionally neutral, prosperous country like Norway is now navigating the fallout of US protectionism and alignment with the EU amid shifting alliances. Socially, investment, pricing, and policy decisions in Norway, from seafood to sovereign funds, now hinge on a relationship shaken by sudden tariff shockwaves. But what if these tariffs aren't really about Norway at all? Think about it. Norway only sends 3.5% of its total exports to the US. That's a drop in the ocean compared to the EU, which swallows up 2/3 of Norway's trade. From that angle, this isn't an economic war. It's a symbolic shot across the bow. A signal to allies and rivals alike that America's trade rules are now written in Washington, not Brussels. Seen this way, Norway becomes less of a target and more of a message, a pawn in a much bigger chess game of global trade realignment. And the real story isn't just about salmon or sofas, it's about how the US is reshaping the very rules of globalization, one tariff at a time. For decades, Norwegian salmon has been a quiet superstar of global trade. In fact, the US is one of its fastest growing markets. By 2024, Norwegian seafood exports to America totaled nearly 62 billion Norwegian crowns, with salmon making up over 20% of that figure. Demand had doubled since 2019 as American consumers embraced sushi, poke bowls, and protein-rich diets. But on August 7, 2025, all those shipments were suddenly slapped with a 15% tariff. For salmon farmers like SalMar and Mowi, that meant razor-thin margins shrank overnight. SalMar openly admitted uncertainty about whether to keep prioritizing the US market or pivot harder toward Asia. Chile and Scotland, both salmon exporters, exempt from the new US tariffs. immediately saw an opening, poised to take market share away from Norway. So, what was once a growth engine for Norwegian seafood is now a battleground of global competition. If you've ever sat in a recliner that felt like a throne, that's a good chance it was from Acorns, Norway's iconic furniture maker. Their trustless chairs have a cult following in the US, where design-conscious buyers are willing to pay a premium for Scandinavian craftsmanship. But Acorns has already admitted that with tariffs in place, it can't absorb the extra cost. Instead, prices for American customers will rise potentially by hundreds of dollars per chair. That makes the company vulnerable in a competitive furniture market where cheaper European or Asian alternatives are only a click away. In other words, a tariff doesn't just hit a company's bottom line, it reshapes consumer behavior, turning a luxury symbol into a tougher sell. Then there's the giant in the room, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest. On paper, the fund isn't directly affected by tariffs, but politically, it's become entangled. In August 2025, the fund divested from Caterpillar, citing concerns over human rights and its ties to Israel. That decision sparked outrage in Washington, with US Senator Lindsey Graham calling for retaliatory tariffs and even visa restrictions on Norway. This is where trade collides with politics. Tariffs weren't just about economics anymore, they became a lever of diplomatic pressure, where one financial decision in Oslo triggered threats from Washington. For Norway, it showed just how quickly economic stability can turn into political vulnerability. On a macro level, Norway's story fits into a much larger puzzle. The US tariffs didn't just target Norway, they hit 66 countries at once, including Switzerland, New Zealand, and even key EU partners. Norway, though small in export volume to the US, became symbolic. Even America's closest allies weren't safe from the tariff hammer. This raises a deeper question. If energy exports were exempt but everyday goods like salmon and furniture weren't, is the US carving out strategic priorities while signaling that no trade relationship is sacred? Norway's role as both an ally and a supplier made it the perfect test case. From fish farms in the Arctic to recliner showrooms in New York, from sovereign wealth boardrooms in Oslo to political halls in Washington, these tariffs ripple across industries, consumers, and even diplomatic ties. They show how a 15% tax on imports isn't just an economic adjustment, it's a reshuffling of global power dynamics. So, what's really driving this tariff clash? On the surface, it looks like a simple trade dispute. America says Norway's salmon industry and furniture makers have an unfair edge, Norway cries foul, and tariffs get slapped. But underneath, the story is more like a domino chain reaction. Think of it this way. Tariffs are like a tax wall. The US raises the wall, forcing Norwegian exporters to either climb over it by accepting higher costs or walk around by rerouting trade to Europe or Asia. In the short term, the wall protects US producers. But in the long run, walls don't just keep goods out, they redirect entire rivers of global commerce. Take Norwegian salmon. Before tariffs, it could reach US supermarkets at competitive prices. After a 15% hike, suddenly Chilean salmon becomes cheaper on American shelves. That means American buyers shift away from Norway, not because Norway's fish got worse, but because Washington changed the rules of the game. Its cause and effect in its simplest form, policy shapes markets. Now zoom out. Norway's furniture exports, brands like Acorns, famous for its luxury trussless chairs, face the same issue. A tariff doesn't just raise prices, it undercuts the brand's market positioning. Why would a US consumer pay thousands for a recliner when suddenly it costs 15% more than a domestic or Asian alternative? That one tariff can ripple across the company's entire US strategy. But here's the kicker. Tariffs aren't just about money, they're about leverage. But targeting Norway, the US sends a signal to the entire European Union. Washington is saying, if we are willing to tax even close allies' goods, imagine what we'll do to bigger players. It's like throwing a small rock into a pond. The splash is small, but the ripples reach every shore. And this is where economics meets geopolitics. Norway may lose a few $100 million in exports, but the broader effect is psychological. Investors get nervous, supply chains rethink routes, and smaller nations wonder if they are next in line. The data backs this up. Studies on past US tariffs like those against China in 2018 showed that US consumers bore nearly 90% of the cost through higher prices, while supply chains slowly shifted away from Chinese manufacturers. In other words, tariffs rarely punish just the target, they often boomerang back to hurt the very people they were supposed to protect. So the deeper question is this: are tariffs an economic shield, or are they a geopolitical weapon disguised as one? Because if it's the latter, then Norway's salmon and sofas are just the opening act in a much larger drama. So what can Norway and the world actually do when tariffs wars erupt? The first and most obvious path is negotiation. Trade disputes have been around since the dawn of modern commerce, and history shows that tariffs are often just bargaining chips. Think back to the US-EU dispute over steel and aluminum in 2018. Initially, tariffs shook both economies, but within 3 years, Washington and Brussels struck a deal to remove most barriers. Norway could follow a similar path. Sit down with Washington, offer concessions, maybe on regulatory alignment or digital trade, and hope diplomacy cools the fire. The benefit here, it de-escalates tensions. The downside, it often requires giving up something in return. Another pathway is diversification. Instead of relying heavily on the US market, Norway could pivot more aggressively toward Asia. In fact, it's already happening. Norwegian salmon exports to China and South Korea have been rising steadily, and Southeast Asia is a booming market for seafood and design furniture. Diversification is like investing in a portfolio. If one stock tanks, the others keep you afloat. The trade-off, however, is time. Building trust and logistics networks in new markets doesn't happen overnight. A third option is innovation and branding. If tariffs make Norwegian goods pricier, then those goods must offer something no competitor can match. For salmon, that could mean doubling down on sustainability certifications, traceability, and premium branding, turning the tariff into a luxury tax that wealthier consumers are still willing to pay. For furniture, it could mean emphasizing Norway's design heritage and quality over mass-produced alternatives. The benefit, it creates resilience. The risk, it limits the customer base to niche, higher-income markets. There is also the collective defense approach. Norway, as part of the European Economic Area, could lobby the EU to step in with countermeasures or collective bargaining. This strategy has teeth. The EU is one of the few actors big enough to face the US without blinking. But there's a trade-off. Collective action means surrendering some independence. Norway's unique concerns might get diluted in Brussels' bigger agenda. Finally, there is the long game. Investing in new industries at home. Tariffs are a reminder of vulnerability. If Norway can't rely forever on salmon, oil, and furniture, maybe it doubles down on green tech, offshore wind, or software exports, sectors less likely to face food-oriented or manufacturing tariffs. The upside, it future-proofs the economy. The trade-off, it takes decades to see real payoff. At the end of the day, none of these solutions are silver bullets. They are more like tools in a kit. The real challenge is picking the right combination: diplomacy to ease short-term pain, diversification to spread risk, and innovation to keep Norway's brand strong in a world where trade barriers can rise overnight. But here's the uncomfortable truth. None of these pathways are perfect. Negotiations can cool tensions, but they're often slow and fragile. One election, one new leader, and the deal could collapse overnight. Diversification sounds wise, but Asian markets come with their own risks. Stricter standards, political sensitivities, and competition from countries far closer to those buyers than Norway could ever be. Innovation and premium branding, it works, but only for the wealthy slice of the global market. What about the middle-class families in Europe or the US who simply won't pay double for a Norwegian salmon fillet when Chilean or Canadian fish is half the price? That's a human-level constraint. Consumers have limits. Even relying on the EU has trade-offs. Collective defense gives Norway leverage, but it also ties the country's hands to Brussels' broader agenda. What if the EU wants to prioritize German car exports over Norwegian salmon? Suddenly, Norway's bargaining power shrinks. And then there is the long game. Building new industries at home. Yes, it's visionary. Yes, it could future-proof Norway's economy, but it requires heavy public investment, political consensus, and most importantly, patience. Decades of patience. And in the meantime, ordinary Norwegian workers and exporters would still feel the squeeze. This is the paradox of global trade wars. There is no clean exit. every solution carries risks, compromises, and unintended consequences. It's not just about economics, it's about politics, human choices, and the delicate balance of a small country navigating storms created by giants. So, whether or not you care about tariffs on fish or the fine print of international trade deals, it's clear that something bigger is happening here. Trump's tariffs on Norway aren't just about salmon, they are about power, leverage, and the new rules of global economics. If Norway adapts wisely, it could turn this crisis into a springboard for innovation and resilience. But if it stumbles, it risks becoming a cautionary tale of how even wealthy nations can be squeezed when superpowers flex their muscles. And that leaves us with one big question. In a world where trade wars are becoming the new normal, will small but wealthy nations like Norway rewrite their future, or have it written for them? If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us reach more curious minds like you. And if you want to dive deeper into how Trump's global ambitions shape geopolitics, check out our next video where Trump wants to buy Greenland. Trust me, it's a story you don't want to miss. Thanks for watching, mate, and thanks for hitting the subscribe button.